United States of America. There is no...
So that was a famous speech that the candidate delivered. And let's, for a second, try to divorce ourselves from our own political views, like whether you're stoked about this or you're annoyed about this. Let's imagine we are in the position of having to make a decision about what shows up on this website. I want to poll the audience here. What do you think was most effective in getting people to pay attention and eventually sign up for this list? So, who thinks get involved? 1. Who thinks family? 0. Who thinks change? Several hundred of you. Who thinks Barack's video? Who thinks the Springfield video? Handful. Who thinks, this is called Sam's video, but that was that last one. All right, a good number of you. So I would say, just eyeballing it, it was kind of a tie between Sam's video and change. This almost never happens, but I'm delighted to say that everyone in the room was wrong. Unless I misremembered. I don't remember seeing any hands for this one. So maybe there was one. So the family image ended up being the winner. And there's a whole bunch of questions you could ask about, like, why? Why did this resonate with people more than others, right? So this is one of the characteristics of, I think, any interesting experiments is it ought to give you more questions than it does answers. But we're not going to deal with any of that now, about the psychology of maybe why this is more effective or any of that. There is one aspect of this experiment that I would like to dwell on for a minute. And it's the most interesting thing about this experiment, I think, is that this poll that we just did informally in this room is similar to a poll that they ran inside the campaign staff prior to running the experiment. So they asked everyone on the campaign staff, which of these should we choose? And the interesting thing about that is that when you stack ranked the sort of collective wisdom of the campaign staff, all 3 videos outranked all 3 images. But when they ran the experiment and actually looked at what real web traffic was doing when they put these treatments out there, all 3 images outperformed all 3 videos. So the campaign staff got it dead wrong. And I'll pause and I'll ask, why did they get that wrong?
One insight is that they were so involved and enthralled in the campaign that they think that video is such a hot thing. Wouldn't we just love to see a video, just a nice static epic image?
They are drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Yeah. This is the definition of preaching to the choir when you're asking an audience like this. Like, they're already on board. They've kind of, they're maybe way more receptive to the message than your average kind of like, oh, who's this Barack guy? Web visitor. What are some other reasons we think they might have voted for these videos? Go ahead.
Well, most people I don't think will click through a video because they don't really have time to, or they just want to get the message and move on.
Totally. I mean, just like we were like, how stressed we were when we were going to like flip to this slide about the volume. Like, opening a video on autoplay with sound is a horrible experience, right? Now, this was like 12 years ago, and so maybe we were a little less refined in how we designed and built web pages, but I mean, that wasn't a foregone conclusion then. So it's kind of obvious to me and to us now, I think, why those didn't perform well. But there's another aspect of why I feel like these got votes from campaign staff, or more votes than maybe the images did. And that's because I'm willing to bet that the campaign spent probably an order of magnitude more time and money and effort building these videos than they did the web pages. Or sorry, the static images. And this is an example of how hard it is to be objective about the quality of your work when you're super close to it, right? Like, this is a bias that we all suffer from. The closer you get to something, the more invested and involved you get into something, the harder it is to be objective about how some random stranger is going to interpret your work. That's one of the reasons I think experimentation is so powerful, because it allows creators to divorce themselves from their own bias and their own opinions and collect objective feedback on what they're building. So, campaign was a success. They achieved their ultimate success metric. And at this point, Dan moved back to San Francisco. And he and I started our first company. It had nothing to do with any of this. This is called Carrot Sticks. This was an online math game for young kids. We spent about 9 months building this. The idea was to give students a way to compete with each other in real time in trying to solve math problems quickly. And this thing is just riddled with our own biases. Growing up, we both liked math and we both liked computers, and so we figured that combining the two things would be unstoppable. We were pretty wrong. So we learned a lot of hard lessons and earned very little money in this first experiment, this first failed experiment. And we moved on after about 9 months and started our second company. And we, at this point, applied to a startup accelerator in the Bay Area called Y Combinator. Has anybody heard of Y Combinator? Okay, yeah. So this was our application video for our second idea.
Hi, I'm Pete.
And I'm Dan. We're both former product managers at Google and studied a bunch of computer science stuff in college. I also worked a little bit on the Obama campaign and then did the presidential transition. Now I'm doing a startup with Pete here in San Francisco called Carrot Sticks.
So we started working on Carrot Sticks about 4 or 5 months ago, and the biggest problem that we ran into was distribution. So getting people to use the software and getting people to talk about the software with their friends. And so we started thinking very hard about that problem and how we would try to solve it, and came up with an idea that we're calling Spreadly.
Spreadly is very simply a discount a merchant can give to a customer if that customer is willing to tell their friends through Twitter, through Facebook, through email about the product that they just bought. Today it's live on Carrot Sticks. You can buy subscription to Carrot Sticks, and if you do that, you can get a discount if you tell your friends.
And so the kicker is that discount is based on our estimate of your online influence. And so we're looking across various different social networks, maybe even blogs at some point, and other ways of interacting online. And we try to estimate the customer's influence with other people online. And based on that influence, we can calculate a discount that that customer should receive.
So this was our second idea, our second experiment. And for anybody wondering whether or not startups are hard, you may notice a difference in my appearance today versus then. I've opted for a more aerodynamic look these days. But so a few things about this. Just to explain this idea, the first big lesson that we learned with Carrot Sticks was that, unfortunately for us, like, building the product was not the hard part. The hard part was building something that resonated with your audience and reaching that audience and convincing them to pay for what you had built. And so our second idea was basically like, wow, we kind of suck at this. I bet we're not the only ones. Let's try and build something to help make this problem easier for other people to solve. And so our idea was, if you're an online merchant, you paste this little widget onto your checkout page, and the widget basically says, hey, thanks for buying something. If you share this with your friends, if you tweet this, we'll give you a 5% discount on your next purchase. And this was our really badly designed homepage at the time. And this also totally failed. Does anybody want to guess why?
Too busy.
Too busy. The web page. Yeah, I agree with that. It's way too busy. It's like you got to read a novel just to understand what it is. Go ahead.
Still looking for that perfect customer. You don't quite know who they are yet.
Yeah. There's a lot of problems with this webpage, and I don't even want to dwell on that because I think there's a more fundamental reason that this company failed, and that is that this had all the kind of keywords for like a successful sounding startup at the time, like Twitter API, like social referrals, things like that. But in reality, not many people are willing to spam all their friends in exchange for a 5% discount. It's just kind of the fact. We got a couple customers. We had this out in the wild, and it's just, the reality is that very few people were actually engaging with this. And so that was our second failed experiment. And at this point, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and for example, in the first project, what was like the biggest issue? It was with the kids or with
Let's talk about that afterwards. So that,
okay.
Education startups are really hard, and we definitely learned some really hard lessons about why that is. And I'm happy to go into it. So I think we'll have time for Q&A after this, and we can get more into that. It's pretty interesting, I think. But So anyway, this also didn't work, right? We had an assumption that was just totally off about how humans behaved. And that's another value of running an experiment. This wasn't kind of a classic A/B test, but we built something really fast. We got it out there, and we learned very quickly that we were like barking up the wrong tree. This is where we eventually settled. So this is about a year after we started working together. We had gone through our first idea, Carrot Sticks, it didn't work. We'd gone through our second idea, Spreadly, it didn't work. And at this point, we're kind of desperate. And we definitely learned an awful lot about how good our own ideas were, which is to say not very good, right? It definitely took us down a few pegs, I would say. And we kind of came back to this idea of experimentation. And specifically, Dan sort of was like, you know, we ran experiments like this on the Obama campaign. It was very effective, but it was also very hard to do. And that was the insight that sort of germinated into the company we founded, which is called Optimizely. We wanted to make it easier for organizations to run experiments on their digital properties. At the time, we were really only looking at websites. You can see website optimization made easy, A/B testing you'll actually use. This is probably about a year or two in that this snapshot came from, but I think you get the idea. And one of the ways in which we forced ourselves to experiment and to validate our assumptions very early here was that we had gotten so skeptical of our own ideas that we didn't write any code until we found somebody who would be willing to pay for what we were doing. And we, is there a water bottle? A water bottle? Oh, wonderful, thank you. So we came up with this idea and we talked through it. And then Dan called 2 agencies that he worked with on the Obama campaign and described what we wanted to do and said that they could have early access for $1,000 a month. And both of them said yes. And so we earned more in like a day with this than we did in the previous entire year over 2 companies. And so that is like that metric, I think, the time from inception to first dollar. I have a slide, not in this talk, but where I talk about that like over time for us. And so for Carrot Sticks, I think it was like 5.5 or 6 months. For Spreadly, it was a month and a half, and for Optimizely, it was a day. And this is, in my mind, this is a measure of how we were learning to be more effective entrepreneurs, how we were learning to validate our ideas, and how we were learning a healthy sense of skepticism for what we were building. But at this point, I'm going to stop talking about our story and talk a bit more about the idea of experimentation. And this is a book that Dan and I wrote in 2013. It's called A/B Testing, the most powerful ways to turn clicks into customers. And we focused in this book on kind of the lone experimentation hero, the young Dan Soroker who's trying to bring this idea into their organization. We mostly focus on the challenges that person would have tactically in running experiments. Focus on the technology. We focused on defining success criteria, things like that. All of the things that might come to mind if you were trying to run an experiment. But one of the things that I have learned over the years is that many of the challenges with experimentation are cultural. They're only things you run into when you try to scale this process. You try to go from running a handful of experiments each year on your website or your apps or whatever to hundreds or thousands of experiments each year. And so what I want to talk about here are the 7 habits of product experimentation cultures. Because I think the good news is that when you go out and you talk to folks who run these experimentation programs at the Googles or the Facebooks or the Airbnbs, companies that have really mechanized this process, there's a lot of really simple habits that you start to observe on a day-to-day basis, and many of them share these in common. And these are things that I think are a lot easier to start in your organization, whether it's one person or hundreds or 1,000 people. So I'm going to go through all 7 of these, and I'm going to talk about hopefully some interesting examples as we go. The first one is so simple. It's just asking about experiment results. So how do you create a culture in which experimentation becomes the norm? You ask. I spoke to folks at Facebook, and one of the things that struck me was that it's kind of unthinkable there to launch a product without having collected data by running an experiment first, right? And the reason for that is because when they have their product reviews, product leaders and engineering leaders ask, well, what did you learn in the experiment? And when that question becomes the norm, you start to train product managers and engineers to do that before going into a meeting like that, before going into a conversation or a decision like that. And it's such a simple habit, it's so easy for a leader to take that and to just start asking that question, and it has such a profound impact on how the organization behaves. So that's why I included that first. Second one, I think, is even more interesting. It's a little subversive. But it is, I often see experimentation being used in large organizations to protect big ideas. And I'll talk about what I mean here. So there's an investor, Paul Graham, he founded Y Combinator, and he wrote an essay called Black Swan Farming. And he talks in this essay about why being a good technology investor is so hard. Why it's so hard to find the good ideas. And he argues that this is difficult. It's difficult to spot good ideas because almost all really big good ideas are in the cross or in the intersection between is a good idea and seems like a bad idea. And why is that? Well, if it's only in the blue circle, then it's obvious and somebody has already done this. If it's only in the red circle, then it's a bad idea. And that's obvious too. It's the ones in the middle that end up being so valuable. And I'm willing to bet that any one of us can look back and think about startups where when you first heard about it, you were like, well, that's dumb. Like Twitter, right? Posting 140 characters online. Facebook, it was like a dating site for horny college students at first. Like, could anyone have predicted how valuable and how much potential that idea had? Airbnb, it's a way to rent out your couch to strangers. Right? These are ideas that have changed the way that we live our lives on a daily basis, but they started out as things where most of us, myself included, probably wrote them off. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why it gets so difficult for larger organizations to be innovative. And that's because it's just so easy for people to say no to an idea, right? The bigger your organization is, the more people there are who can say no to your idea. It's really, really simple. I saw this firsthand at Google, actually. When I was there, and when Dan was there, it was not uncommon as a product manager to find yourself presenting to the founders of Google. And they would do these product reviews, and you had to show them that, well, this is what we're working on, this is what we're going to launch. And there was a well-known trick inside the product organization where if they ever didn't like something that you were going to do, you could just say, don't worry, we're just going to run an experiment. And that was kind of the cheat code to getting something launched that they weren't a fan of. And I thought of this as, at the time I just sort of thought of this as like a cheat code, like we're getting around Google's culture, to get shit done. It's only now that I realized that was actually a key part of Google's culture, was that it enabled people who were lower down in the organizational food chain to take their ideas and to give them air cover with an experiment in order to get to the point where they were validated, right? Because it's much easier to argue in favor of a good idea once it's out there in the world and you can actually collect information about it. Most ideas aren't very good, right? That's the point. But the ones that are often don't see the light of day unless they're given sort of a chance to collect input from customers. And so this was this sort of like bug, which I later understood as a feature of Google culture. And I've seen this in a lot of other places as well. The idea that experiments can be used as air cover for the ideas that seem like bad ideas, that give them enough time to validate whether or not they actually are. There's a really good example of this at Uber. In, I don't know what year this was, but Uber was launching in India. And the team on the ground in India that was responsible for building out the business there argued in favor of launching cash payments, which the management team in the United States was dead set against. And so the team on the ground found a way to run an experiment. So they showed people the option of paying with cash. And rather than trying to create some system where you collect some percentage of cash payments from drivers, what they would do is that if a customer opted to pay in cash, they would just subtract a larger percentage from the next credit card ride that the driver collected. And so they found this sort of low-tech way of getting this out there and running an experiment. And what they found was pretty astonishing. So I think customers who even just shown the option of paying with cash during their onboarding flow were something like 80% more likely to complete the onboarding flow. And for customers who paid with cash, their retention rate was considerably higher, I think more than 100% higher, than for customers who were not shown the option of paying with cash at all. And the team on the ground took this data and came back to the management team and showed them, made this argument, and Travis famously stood up in front of the company and said, we're going to change our mind on this, we were wrong, we're building out cash payments. And they ended up launching cash payments in India, and I believe in Europe as well, or at least certain parts of Europe. This is an example of an idea that without this mechanism, without this sort of try it and see mechanism, would have never seen the light of day. The next habit is celebrating wins. This one's kind of obvious. There's a moment that we like to call the experimentation singularity. And it's this moment when the idea of building experimentation into your product development process starts to catch hold. And one of the ingredients for hitting this point for an organization almost always starts with a really good story around the impact of a successful experiment. Right? One team runs an experiment, and that ends up getting a lot of attention inside of an organization, and more people start asking, well, like, how do we do that? You know? What tools are you using? How do we actually, do the math on this, right? It starts to spread awareness inside of an organization. And so if you're a leader in your organization, or even if you're not a leader in your organization, one way to encourage the adoption of experimentation is just to create a successful case study internally and start talking about that. There's another really good example of this at Uber. I don't know if Uber was available here in Boston very early on, but when Uber was just getting started, there wasn't a way to input your destination when you booked a driver. You would just ask for a driver to show up where you were, and you'd have to get in, and then you'd explain where you wanted to go, and sometimes they would type into Google Maps or whatever, and sometimes they would just try and guess. It was kind of a frustrating experience. And so internally, they knew they wanted to change this, but there was a lot of argument internally about how they should add destination input into their process, into their user flow. And so some people argued that adding it before the driver was there was sort of creating yet another step for users to jump through, and that might discourage people from actually following through and requesting a ride. Others argued that you should absolutely do it up front, and the alternative is like somehow expect the user to sort of pull their phone back out once they've gotten into the car and type it in. And so they resolved this by running an experiment. So they came up with 20 different designs, and then they sat down physically in a room with people and kind of walked them through mock scenarios. And with that, they narrowed it down to 3, and they ran a live experiment in their app. This is one of the first experiments that Uber ever ran. And they found that this particular design, where you enter the address sort of almost at the beginning of the booking flow, was the most successful. It had the most adoption. And the feature that they launched was super successful. And they went out and they talked about it in front of the company. And that example of a successful experiment generated enough interest inside the organization that they ended up investing in a homegrown platform they call Morpheus. They've gone out and they've talked a lot about this. You can read a lot about Morpheus online. But this was the kind of canonical example internally that motivated them to put budget and people and resources and time into building a platform for running experiments internally. The next habit is maybe less intuitive, but it's this idea of celebrating losses, which I think is just as important as celebrating wins. There's a great quote, I think, that captures this. So Jeff Bezos said, "I've made billions of dollars of failures at Amazon.com. Literally billions. How many Fortune 500 CEOs, can you imagine, standing up and bragging about how much money they've lost for their organizations? It's not common. And I think one of his audiences when he said this was actually Amazon employees, maybe the main audience. And what he's doing as a leader is setting the tone that failure is okay. It is okay to try something that doesn't end up working. I think this is so important. It's a characteristic that I've seen over and over again in organizations where experimentation is the norm in product development. It's this idea that as a product manager, as an engineer, you should not be penalized from a career perspective for trying something big, even if it fails. Right? The important thing is trying it, collecting data as quickly as possible, and if it works, awesome. If it doesn't, you move on. But you need this sort of cultural mechanism to sort of normalize the idea of failure. And in many organizations, that's just not the case. Right? People are afraid to try things. There's a wonderful example I found at Intuit for how they do this. I spoke to the person who runs their internal experimentation platform. And he said that teams had built this little game around failures. So if you ran an experiment, each product team that ran an experiment where their original hypothesis was incorrect, which by the way is the majority of experiments, would get a little like plush skunk toy. They call them skunkies. And teams ended up sort of competing with each other, and they would build these little dioramas of like scenes with all these little skunkies in them. And I just love this because it takes this idea of like a team sort of taking each one of its failures and putting it up on display. And the example that sets for everyone else in the organization, I think, is a really powerful one. It's this idea that like as a team, you should be celebrated for the velocity with which you can try new ideas, even if they don't work. And that we're kind of expecting a lot of them not to work as part of the process. The fifth habit is hiring for an experimentation mindset. This one's a little harder to kind of put into a simple box. As anybody knows who's done any recruiting, it's super difficult. It's very, very hard to find folks with the right match of skills and attitude and mindset and all of that. So there's no formula for hiring people that are great at experimentation, but I think it's imperative to do so. Anytime as an organization you want to be really good at something, you have to hire people that are amazing at it. And I found a couple examples of how each company sort of tipped this and internalized it in their own way. At Intuit, they use a framework for making product decisions called goal, question, metric. I don't think they invented this framework. I think it's a general framework for making product decisions. And without going into the details there, one thing they do in their interview process for product managers is to ask them how they make product decisions. And if their decision process shares characteristics with goal, question, metrics, or you set a goal and you articulate a number of questions around that, and then you articulate a set of metrics you'll use to measure your success, then they consider them a stronger cultural fit. There's another great example at The Gap. So I spoke to the head of their analytics team. And he explained that one of the things they ask their candidates to do during the process, during the hiring process, is they give them a set of data, and they ask them to present that data to a panel. And what he looks for is the ability to tell the truth and tell a story. And I asked him why, and he explained that they had, in their history, run an experiment that had gone super sideways. And there was an experiment they ran, and I don't even remember what the experiment's for, but there was some bug in the implementation. And that bug caused the numbers for this experiment to look atrocious. And some overzealous executive got a hold of the numbers and freaked out, and it caused a whole bunch of organizational churn, right? This is, as an analytics leader, like this is when your pager goes off, right? Is when numbers don't make sense or when numbers look really bad. And so the reason that this happened was that somebody was presenting the early data and didn't provide enough context to the executive audience to understand why the numbers look so bad. And so now when they evaluate candidates, what they look for is honesty. You ought to be able to interpret the data correctly and to be able to tell the truth, even if the message is hard. But you need to be able to tell the story to contextualize the data you're telling to your audience. Super important for that. I love this one. It's context over control. This is something I also saw in a lot of these examples when I spoke to experimentation leaders. And I love this quote as a way to capture that. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And that's from The Little Prince. And the reason I think this is so appropriate is because in many organizations that use experimentation to drive product development, the focus is very much on picking metrics that help align the organization on the direction to build. I think there's a great example. I spoke to somebody who was involved in product development and experimentation at both Netflix and Booking.com. So these are both organizations that are famous for running experiments at very high velocity. And the reason I think this example is so interesting is because the product experiences that you get are radically different, even though this was literally the same individual who's responsible for some of this work. And the reason he argued was because they had chosen very different metrics to optimize for. So Netflix, they're optimizing for retention, right? They make money when you become a subscriber and you stay a subscriber. So they're totally focused on lifetime customer value and keeping customers as long as possible. And the experience is sort of very much oriented towards that. They focus on building recommendation algorithms that try to understand your tastes as well as possible. They focus on producing content that try to match the largest majority of their users' preferences. The experience itself is kind of quiet. It's unassuming, or at least it was at this point. It's a little louder these days. But this was the experience they came up with. And if you contrast that with Booking, this was a search I did for hotel rooms in Oregon. Has anybody here used Booking? It's kind of stressful, right?
Yeah. Strange.
So this is the experience you get when you search for hotel rooms in Portland, and I counted 6 different urgency reminders. Right? So there's like, Kimpton Hotel, only 6 rooms left. You just missed it. Our last room sold out a few days ago. You go on there, and all of a sudden you're like, oh God, I should have done this several weeks ago. Like that's always the way I feel when I use the product, and it's very effective. And the difference in this case, I think, is the metric that they have chosen to align the organization on, and it's much more short-term focused metric. It's the percentage of users who end up going through the search and then booking a room. So focusing very much on kind of that session. And this is not a value judgment. I'm not trying to say that one experience is better than the other, right? Like this is what, at least at the time, worked for Booking's business. This is what they arrived on. I know I've spoken to folks on the team, and they have since incorporated longer-term metrics into this as well. I think there are some very good arguments for why these are actually useful to users. But again, no value judgment here. This is merely an illustration of the impact that the choice of metric can have on the product experience that you build. And that's why leaders in organizations that use experimentation like this spend so much time on aligning and choosing the right metric to drive product work. There's another great example. This one's from Facebook. So they launched a feature called Recommended Friends. And so at the time, there was this little drop-down that would show you all the friend requests that you had in Facebook. And when you had gone through all of those, it started just recommending folks. Like, oh, do you know this person, right? And they launched this feature, and they launched it as part of an experiment, and they used sort of friend requests as the metric that was their overall evaluation criterion for this experiment. So they wanted to know, if we launch this recommended friends feature, does this materially increase the number of friend requests that are sent? And it was like a smashing success, right? People were using the hell out of this feature. And so initially they were really stoked, but they did more digging into the data, and they noticed that usage was particularly strong amongst one demographic, and that was young single males. And as you can imagine, there was a pattern where once you'd exhausted kind of the folks in your immediate network, they would start recommending random people. And users were sort of treating this like a Tinder clone. Right? And so maybe not all of these friend requests were appreciated by the person who was getting the friend request. And they ended up going back and revising their metric, and they chose, instead of friend requests sent, to friend requests accepted. Because they decided they don't, there may be an interesting business here, and in fact we've learned since that there is an interesting business here, but they didn't want to be in that business. So not a value judgment, but it was deciding where do we want to go as an organization, what is our strategic direction, and then picking metrics that help align the product organization on developing products that move in that direction. I love that example. The last habit that I'll talk about of experimental product organizations is optimizing for experiment velocity. And I'll use another Bezos quote here. Our success at Amazon is a function of how many experiments we do per week, or per year, per month, per week, per day. So this is another one of these quotes I think that was very much targeted at an internal audience, but is directly tying Amazon's success to the rate at which they can try new ideas, the rate at which they can run experiments. And this is another feature that I've seen in many organizations that have managed to scale up their process, is they've made all sorts of little tweaks to optimize for lowering the bar for running an experiment and to be able to do so as fast as possible. So just a few examples of this. Lowering the approval bar for experiment launches. This can be controversial. But in most organizations, if you're an engineer or product manager, there's a set of hoops you have to jump through in order to launch something. And usually those hoops are there for a really good reason, right? Making sure that your product passes a QA bar, that it's high quality, that it passes a security bar, that no one's going to hack you, that it aligns with brand guidelines, right? One approach that you can take when running experiments is to set sort of a looser set of guidelines around things that are launched as experiments, right? So maybe we collect some data first and then we evaluate whether we want to invest the time and energy in making sure that this product meets our bar. There's a good example. It's a customer that I can't name, but this is a brand that is famous for it's an athletic brand, and they are famous for having a brand image that is aligned with kind of quality and premium pricing. And one of the experiments that they ended up running was what happens if we change our search algorithms to prioritize lower priced items over higher priced items. And they actually found that this increased revenue and throughput on the site. And this sort of caused a bit of an explosion internally because it didn't align with their brand guidelines. And that was one of the questions we got. We have demonstrated aptly that this is better for the company from a revenue perspective, at least in the short term, but we're running into organizational hurdles. And I think this is an example. In this particular case, this is an example of sort of taking something that would never have even been tried without sort of lowering the brand approval bar for running the experiment. And at least now they were able to bring data into the conversation about whether that was the right move for the organization. Building out an experimentation center of excellence. So again, this idea of if you want to be great at something as an organization, you need a group of people that are really good at it to focus on it. So building out a team, and these can be full-time or part-time, of folks who understand the tools that you have available to your organization and also the process, right? Who can answer questions about how to run experiments, who can sort of spread the knowledge internally. This is another pattern that we've seen that ends up being successful. Holding open experiment reviews is another super simple one. So if you want to help encourage your organization to run more experiments, one way to do this is to take folks that have a good understanding, that have a lot of experience in running them, and bring them into a room and make them available for reviewing experiments. And they can review experiment design, they can help review experiment results. And if you do this in an open way, it's a good way to spread best practices and knowledge with the rest of the organization. Investing in education and training, that's kind of obvious, I think. But those are the 7 habits of product experimentation culture. So again, these are simple habits that I have seen over and over again in organizations that have managed to scale the process of using experiments to make data-driven decisions. And I think any one of these things are things that any of us could take and start within our organization today. Right? This I don't think any of these need sort of broad organizational alignment. They can start within a small seed and they can grow from there. And so if you are feeling in your organization like you're at the bottom of this mountain, hopefully some of these may come in handy in your organization. And if so, the hope is that you could be the next Bill Bowerman in your company. So that's the end of my slides. Thank you, everybody. And I think we have time for Q&A.
Yep.
Do. Okay, cool. So, any questions? Go ahead.
Hi, we're a very early stage startup. What are your recommendations on controlling the cost of some of the experimentation?
So, for an early stage startup, what are the recommendations on controlling the cost of experimentation? So, I always think it's interesting talking to early stage startups about running experiments because in many cases I recommend not to do them, or at least not to do them in sort of the canonically correct way, right? Many of the experiments that I showed you sort of depend on having a decent amount of traffic or usage of your app or site and enough to sort of collect statistically significant results and learn something interesting from. And if you're not at that stage yet, it's kind of, in my view, a waste of time and energy to invest in building out a full platform and running a full experiment. And that as a founder, I know, it's often, you can get really good high bandwidth input from users just by sitting down in a room with someone and watching them use your product or talking with them. So experimentation is really, it's one important tool in a toolkit. And where it starts to help is when you have, a larger and more varied set of users, then you're able to collect that kind of information from sitting in a room together. It also allows you to collect really honest feedback, right? It's, as anybody who knows who's tried to collect feedback from people about what you're building, it's very hard to really understand what it is they want. It's often, frustratingly different from what they say they want. So there are places where I think this is an invaluable tool. There are other places where it's less appropriate, and at the very earliest stages of starting a company, that's one of the ones I would say it's less. So, yeah. There are other, not to go too long on this, but I love some of these examples, like the Uber example, where they found kind of a low budget way to implement this cash payments thing. I think very much, in my mind, embodies the spirit of experimentation, where even when you're starting to get enough traffic, but you're trying to do your best to control costs, there's often a really easy way to test something that will save you a tremendous amount of money, right? Like, as a startup, what's the worst, what's the highest cost, lowest payback thing you can do? It's invest a bunch of engineering time in building the wrong thing. And so using an experiment to try to validate, are we actually building the right thing, can, even if that costs money in and of itself, can end up saving you much more down the line. One of the simplest, easiest ways to do this is called a painted door experiment. Has anybody heard of this concept? So the idea comes from the, what?
I thought maybe, is that something that Zappos did just to see if people would sign up to use the product?
That sounds, I don't know that specific example, but what you're describing sounds very much like a painted door experiment, where
Or
the idea is like,
where there's nothing behind it, but
yeah.
just
You create a button where there's nothing behind it. You create a door where there's nothing behind it. The name comes from the old like Roadrunner cartoons, where the Roadrunner would paint a door on a rock and the coyote would run into the rock, which is kind of a shitty metaphor for doing something to your customers. But the idea is, and I'm guessing this is a similar example where Zappos just wanted to know, is somebody going to use, if we build this, is somebody going to use it, right? Is that the example?
yeah, they just collected email addresses like, would people buy shoes online? So they
Perfect.
kind of
So when it sounds like when they were getting started, they just basically built something that was like, a store, and then when you click through, they just collected your email address, which is like the classic painted door thing. It's like, oh, here, try this feature, and then they click through and you're like, oh, sorry, it doesn't exist yet. But give us your email address if you're interested. And it's a super simple, low budget way to test whether or not folks are interested in the thing you're building. Like if you're gonna build a feature, your whole goal is, in most cases, getting people to adopt and use that feature. And why not actually just pretend the feature is there and measure whether people interact with it? If they don't interact with it, then one of your hypotheses is wrong. And you've just saved yourself a bunch of time, right? And maybe it's the design, maybe it's the way you're talking about it, maybe it's your value proposition, maybe it's just that the feature itself doesn't matter, right? But that's a good way to figure that out.
How do you make sure you don't you lose integrity?
How do you make sure you don't lose integrity?
You know what I mean?
So this is another kind of interesting ethical line. And I think lying to customers is never the right thing to do. And so I do think it's important you know, once you click through this button, like, thanks for letting us know you're interested in. Would you be interested in helping us develop this, right? So you're transparent with them. You know, you're not trying to like string them along and say like, oh, it's down at the moment or something like that. Like you want to be very open about what you're doing. And frankly, I think if you're not open, you're missing an opportunity to interact with them and to gather their feedback on what is important to them, right? This is another great way of collecting people who were interested at least in your top level pitch, and now you have a chance to kind of ask them like, okay, so why are you interested in this? Like, what's important to you? Which, you know, you can run designs by them. It's a great way to collect beta users. Yeah.
You can also make it part of your opt-in. You know, we may be testing products on you along the way. My question was with regard to your remarks about the discovery. Are we building the right things? And particularly interested in the way that Kagan explains it as this shift to the left. And I'm wondering, particularly in the startup phase, what have you seen are the 3 biggest blocks and 3 great solutions for embedding that culture of discovery cross-functionally outside of engineering?
So the 3 biggest blocks and the 3 biggest solutions to embedding this sort of culture of maybe I'll call it hypothesis validation, building a startup outside of just engineering. Got it. So you specifically want 3.
Well, and magic number.
So I think that's a really good question. And you know, I guess drawing from my own experience here, as an early stage entrepreneur, like the biggest thing that we had to learn through our first year was like, you know, how do we figure out where we are bullshit, right? Like how do we, going back to this idea of, you know, we tried our first idea and it took us 6 months between inception and the first, frankly, valuable piece of feedback which we got, which was somebody paying for it. And the second startup, which took us a month and a half, and the third startup, which took us a day. This is a measure of how we were getting better at validating our own hypotheses. In terms of how to sort of bake that into your startup, well, I think a lot of the habits that I talk through are good ways to start doing that. I think particularly in the early stage, one of the advantages that you have as a founder is you have a lot of direct influence over the culture of your organization. And you can actually make proactive, hopefully well-articulated decisions about how you want to act as an organization. And so answering these questions about how do we treat failure, how do we think about failure, how do we measure our success, you know, how do we factor metrics and data and numbers into the way we make decisions, you actually have direct control over those things when you're a small team as a founder. And that's really wonderful. It's much harder to make changes to that later on when you're a larger organization. And so I would say as a founder, maybe the most impactful thing you can do is really think hard through this and try to create sort of cultural pillars that make it okay for people to try things and make it okay for people to fail, and build sort of meaningful practice and process around learning from that failure and learning from that process. And you know, socializing that, not just within engineering or not just within product management, but everywhere in the company. So that's maybe the most concrete thing I can suggest as a really early stage founder. Some of these other things where, you know, you actually back these up with the processes and practices that you build, holding experiment reviews, sort of highlighting both wins and losses. These are all really important things for leaders to do early on in the organization, because that really sets the tone for your culture, right? It's not just writing a culture doc or a culture deck. It's actually living those values and providing your organization with examples for why they're important and for how you live them. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
It does. A brief follow-on, which you can consider, or if there's another question, is I think specifically at that point of scaling, when we're relying on offshoring, nearshoring, or some kind of subcontractors that do have a different culture, that is more, how many story points have I done? How many sprints have I done in a month? They're more quantitative driven than hypothesis and curiosity and discovery driven. So you kind of have that mash of the cultures, and it just how you would address that.
Yeah, so I've seen that, and that strikes me. So this example of kind of a product organization or maybe parts of product organization that are driven primarily by looking at the number of story points completed or something like that. It reminds me of, I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a luminary in this space named Rani Kohavi, and there's a quote where he's like, the most common success metric in any organization is percentage of plan completed, which is a terrible metric, right? It's not a good overall metric. It's maybe a good metric to help you examine your organization's efficiency, but if the metric of success is how much of our plan did we complete, you've totally missed the point. And so this example that you're giving, where maybe there's too much focus on the percentage of story points that have been completed, it suggests to me that there wasn't or there hasn't been enough time spent at the leadership level aligning on like, what is the ultimate success metric for the work that we're doing? And then what kind of check-in points and practices can we build along the way to make sure that what we're building is actually aligned at that success metric? It's not to say that tracking story points and efficiency is not important, but if that's the only thing you're tracking, then that's the only thing you're optimizing for. So that's where my mind goes on that one.
Maybe one more short one, and then we'll take a break before the panel.
Got it. Okay.
I know that context over control, we don't want to put too many controls or things to stringently hamper an experiment, but are there common parameters that you could consider to making your experiment naturally successful in proving or disproving your hypothesis?
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, so in the world of science, experiments are they're very isolated from a lot of things to prevent outside influence from ruining the experiment from being successful. But in product experimentation, it seems like anything's game almost. But it could leave the door open to, in my opinion, again, it's not tested, influences from the experiment or factors not considered during the experiment that could prevent your experiment from being truthfully carried out or done correctly.
So I think this is a really good question. And maybe I would summarize it, correct me if I'm wrong in doing so, by saying how do you make sure that you're using good experiment design? Right? Designing a good experiment or a successful experiment, which I'm going to interpret as not as one where your original hypothesis was validated specifically, but one in which you're actually learning something meaningful about your hypothesis, right? That's a well-designed experiment. And designing experiments is really hard. As anybody in the world of science knows, like it's super hard. And there are so many places that can go wrong. Maybe I'll start by saying that a controlled experiment like an A/B test it's one of the whole reasons for doing that is so you can isolate as many variables, you can isolate the variable that's important to you and ignore almost everything else, right? So like this is why it's not often effective to sort of look at your analytics yesterday and make a change and look at your analytics today, because there's a million things that could have changed between yesterday and today that could influence the outcome. And so running a controlled experiment where you're over the same block of time isolating all other variables from the one that you're trying to understand is maybe the best way of answering a question like that. But there's still many places where experimental error can come in. You can have biased samples. You can have biased experimenters who are maybe they want something to win, and and you can help mitigate for that by having sort of an independent integrity folks, like maybe your analytics or your data science team who's responsible for reviewing experiments and don't necessarily have an organizational bias towards one outcome or another. But that topic, I think, is a much longer, harder one. I would say maybe the simplest answer to your question of how do you ensure that you have good experiment design is hire someone who's good at experiment design and put them in a place in your organization where they don't have a strong organizational bias. And then there's way more interesting details beyond that, but we don't have time for it, I think, today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
So there's still food if anybody's hungry. We'll take about a 15-minute break, and we'll start the panel for any of you with additional questions we can dig into at 10:30.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
What?
hardware one?
So I'm doing recently afternoon dances. Well, we actually took the beach back the big garage door. Yes. Yes. And then a job sack, and then they said it was
Oh my goodness.
So yeah.
Now I'm gonna find pictures of
One portion of the house that I just like, because they're trying to find and they also have just a lot of them are lights and stuff. They have some lights that are on like $2,000. You have to obviously control. Generally, you have to sell the board.
Yeah.
So,
The guy that I knew that was doing it said, okay. However, how hard is it?
because it's so hard at this, they're so big.
We started with
We started with